On this edition of History Road Trip, we're going to discuss the presidential election of 1824. This is one of my favorite ones to study. It's very interesting. And it's important for several reasons. It's one of only two elections in U.S. history to be decided by the House of Representatives. And it's the last election to be decided by the House of Representatives. The other one was 1800, in case you were wondering. And we'll probably feature that one at some point in the future. The 1824 election featured four candidates in the general election, some of the most dominant political figures of the early 19th century. It also spelled the end of one of the nation's first political parties and ushered in the second party system in American politics. So let's talk about why it plays out this way. In order to do this, you need a little bit of background. Why are there so many candidates in 1824? Well, by 1824, there's only one political party left in the United States, and that was the Democratic Republican Party. This party had coalesced in the early 1790s around the philosophy and vision of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Their opponents, the Federalists, had formed around the same time, led by Alexander Hamilton and John Adams. Now, the Federalists were dominant early. George Washington was not a member of either party. He eschewed party affiliation, but some of his most important advisors, including Hamilton, were Federalists. Okay? His vice president, John Adams, was a Federalist. In 1796, when Washington refused to run for a third term, his vice president, John Adams, defeated Thomas Jefferson for the presidency. So early on, the Federalists were dominant. Unfortunately for them, that was the last presidential election they ever won. Thomas Jefferson won in 1800 and 1804. His best friend and Secretary of State, James Madison, won in 1808 and 1812. And then Madison's Secretary of State, James Monroe, won in 1816 and 1820. The final straw for the Federalists came toward the end of the War of 1812. That war was very unpopular in the Northeast and New England, and that's where the Federalists were the strongest. So in late 1814, New England Federalists sent delegates to a meeting in Hartford, Connecticut called the Hartford Convention, where they aired their grievances about the War of 1812. They came up with a list of demands, which included some interesting things. One of the things they wanted was a constitutional amendment to prevent two presidents in a row from the same state. That's obviously aimed at Jefferson and Madison, both Virginians. Madison was the president at this point. Okay? More importantly, they hinted at secession. They didn't really come out and openly say we're going to secede if the war doesn't end, but they hinted around it. Now, there's debate as to whether or not they actually were serious about that. I doubt they seriously wanted secession, but it looks bad. And then the timing of the Hartford Convention was all wrong. When the convention ended, they sent three delegates to Washington, D.C., all three were from Massachusetts, to present this list of demands to Congress. Now, there's no way that Congress, which was dominated by Democratic Republicans, would ever accede to these demands. Unfortunately, by the time they arrived in D.C. in February of 1815, the Capitol had already learned that the war had ended. The Treaty of Ghent, which was signed in Belgium on Christmas Eve of 1814, was a peace treaty that ended hostilities between the United States and Great Britain. And even worse, they had also learned that on January the 6th, 1815, Andrew Jackson had defeated the British Army at the Battle of New Orleans. So how does that make the Federalists look? They show up in town saying, and kind of hinting around and threatening, if this war doesn't end, we're going to secede, only to find out not only has the war ended, but we've won a major victory over the British under Andrew Jackson. Well, it makes them look stupid, and it makes them look seditious. And this is what finally killed off the Federalist Party. Americans turned on them after this. They run a candidate in 1816. They run a candidate for president named Rufus King. He'll be crushed by James Monroe. Something like, I think it was 183 electoral votes to 34 electoral votes for King. So from 1816 to 1824, there's only one political party in the United States. During Monroe's entire presidency, the Democratic Republicans are the only game in town. That's why this 8-year period becomes known as the era of good feelings. It's not that everybody agreed, it just you didn't have a lot of the partisan bickering that had characterized the early battles between Jefferson and Hamilton. Okay? When Monroe runs for re-election in 1820, he runs unopposed. Nobody ran against him. That's the last president to ever run unopposed, and only the second one. Only George Washington besides Monroe, had run unopposed. Monroe also, he receives every electoral vote but one. One elector from Massachusetts named William Plummer voted against him because he thought Washington should be the only unanimously elected president. Okay? So by the time you get to 1824, that's why there are so many candidates. Okay? In a normal two-party system, each party puts their best guy forward. But with only one party around, several Democratic Republicans thought they should run. So let's talk about who the candidates in 1824 were. First one was a man named William Crawford of Georgia. Crawford was the sitting Secretary of Treasury. He'd been around for a while. He's very old school Jeffersonian Democratic Republican, meaning he believed in state sovereignty, strict construction of the Constitution, meaning if it's not spelled out in plain language of the Constitution, you can't do it. He had served in the Georgia legislature. He had been a senator for Georgia, ambassador to France. He'd been the Secretary of War under James Madison and Secretary of Treasury for both of Monroe's 2 terms. Now, unfortunately for Crawford, he had suffered a stroke in late 1823. Kind of hard to run for president when you're recovering from a stroke. And yet Crawford felt by 1824 he was sufficiently recovered that he decided to run anyway. Okay? Your next candidate is going to be a name you recognize, and that'll be John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts. He is the son of former President John Adams. John Quincy Adams was a very accomplished diplomat. He had followed his father to diplomatic posts all over the world, including England at one point. He had been our ambassador to Russia. Under Monroe, he had been the Secretary of State. And in my opinion, John Quincy Adams was probably the best Secretary of State this country ever had. Under his leadership, the United States purchased Florida for $15 million, which is a steal, and settled the western border with Spain. Adams is going to run on 3 things, and these are 3 things that younger Democratic Republicans found very important in the years directly after the War of 1812. He wants to see the federal government become more active, and he wants to see the federal government pay for internal improvements. And by internal improvements, that's what today we would call infrastructure. In other words, canals, highways, bridges, things like that paid for by the national government. Okay? He also wants to see high tariffs. The idea behind high tariffs, of course, tariff is a tax on imported goods. And at this period of time, New England is starting to become more industrial. But they're having to compete with Britain, who had been doing industry for a while already, and they produce things cheaply and more efficiently, and they produce better stuff. So how do you get the American or the New England industry off the ground? Well, you got to keep out competition from British goods. So high tariffs were the way to do that. If you place high tariffs on British products, the thinking is people are forced to buy American goods, and that gets America's industry off the ground. Okay. The third thing that John Quincy Adams promoted was something called the Second Bank of the United States. This was a national bank. We'd had one. Alexander Hamilton had proposed one in the 1790s, and Congress established it, but its charter ran out in 1811, and at the time, President Madison let it run out and wasn't interested in rechartering it. Then during the War of 1812, it ran out of money, realized, dang, we could have used a national bank. So Madison will lead the charge after the War of 1812 to get a second one. It's chartered in 1816 and set to run for 20 years until 1836. Okay, so those 3 things: internal improvements, high tariffs, national bank, are the things that John Quincy Adams is running on. Now, those 3 agenda items had already been packaged into a legislative agenda by a Kentucky politician named Henry Clay. Henry Clay called that the American system because he believed it would benefit the entire country. Well, speaking of Henry Clay, he's going to be our 3rd candidate in 1824. Clay was from Kentucky. He'd been born in Virginia to a pretty wealthy family, very wealthy man, had a big plantation outside Lexington, Kentucky. He had served in the House of Representatives starting in 1811. By this point, he was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. So he's somebody that had a lot of legislative power, had a lot of clout. He'll wind up running for president 3 times over the course of his life, never wins. But he's known today as the great compromiser because he's a man that at several occasions in the early days of this republic when it looked like we were about to come to blows, mostly over sectional issues, Henry Clay would step up and offer a compromise. But at this point, he's the Speaker of the House. And then your fourth candidate was Andrew Jackson of Tennessee. Now, Jackson had been born in the Carolinas. We're not exactly sure which Carolina he was born in. The little settlement that he was born in, Waxhaws, was right on the line between North and South Carolina. So we're really not sure. Both states claim him, by the way. But he was born in the Carolinas, moved to Tennessee as a young man, and became a lawyer. And Jackson basically personified the American dream in the 19th century. He's a self-made man. He was born dirt poor, wound up becoming a successful lawyer, a judge, a planter. He had a big plantation outside Nashville, Tennessee, and eventually a general. He became a national hero because of his military leadership. He led the Tennessee militia during the Creek War of 1813 and 14, defeated the Creek Indians at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814 in what's today Alabama, and then defeated the British Army at the Battle of New Orleans in January of 1815, which was very consequential. If the British had conquered New Orleans, they could have choked off our commerce on the Mississippi River. Now, Jackson doesn't have a whole lot of experience in government at this point. He had served some brief terms as a senator and a representative from Tennessee. He didn't really have a platform either. The other three guys have things they want to accomplish. Jackson didn't really have a platform. He ran promising to, quote, advance the rights of the common man, unquote. So he's kind of like the everyman candidate. And he also said he was running against a, quote, corrupt aristocracy. He believed that politics had become very corrupt, due largely to the fact that you had politicians that had stayed in the national government forever, thought it was time for some fresh blood. Okay? So those are your four candidates. Now, initially you had five. Early on, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina is thinking about running. But then he looks around at this crowded field and he sees, wait, there's Adams, there's Clay, there's Crawford. These three guys have got a lot of clout in the national government. There's Jackson, who's a war hero. There's no way I'm going to win. So Calhoun did something really smart. He ran for vice president with both Adams and Jackson. He ran as both man's running mate. So if either Adams or Jackson wins, Calhoun's going to get to be vice president. Okay? Now, you can imagine how this is going to turn out. With four candidates, nobody got a majority of electoral votes. Andrew Jackson got a plurality. He got the most electoral votes with 99. He also got the largest percentage of popular votes. Now, of course, that doesn't count in our system, but it gave him the belief that he ought to be the one to win this election. John Quincy Adams got 84 electoral votes. He came in second. William Crawford, despite having had a stroke, came in 41. And then Henry Clay came in dead last with 37. Now, when no candidate has a majority, 50% of the electoral votes, what happens? Well, according to the 12th Amendment, what you have, the House of Representatives has to decide who the president is. That had only happened one time before. It had happened in 1800, which was a total mess of an election. And it's after 1800 that they passed the 12th Amendment. But the 12th Amendment says there will be a runoff in the House of Representatives. They'll decide in a contingent election who will be the president. And it will be among the runoff of the top three vote getters. So that means Henry Clay's out. He comes in fourth. He's no longer in it. However, remember, he's the Speaker of the House, which means he's still got a lot of influence and a lot of power over this election, right? And it becomes pretty well known that whoever Henry Clay decides to support for the presidency is probably who's going to win because he's able to sway a lot of votes in the House of Representatives. Jackson made the case that he ought to be the one that gets to get the contingent vote in the House of Representatives because he had the most electoral votes. He had the biggest percentage of popular votes. The problem is Henry Clay despised Andrew Jackson. They did not like each other at all. Clay could be a bit of a snob, and he looked down on Jackson. He's a dirt poor kid. He's new money. He's not old money. He's kind of disreputable the way Henry Clay looked at it. Jackson didn't care for Clay very much either. And Clay even said during this time, this is a direct quote, "I cannot believe that killing 2,500 Englishmen at New Orleans qualifies for the various difficult and complicated duties of the chief magistrate." Okay? John Quincy Adams didn't like Jackson either. He had actually, he had dealt with Jackson when he was the Secretary of War, or Secretary of State rather, and Jackson was in command of the Army on our border with Florida. Adams originally wanted Jackson to run for the vice presidency, and the reason why was he didn't think he could do much damage as vice president. Here's a quote from John Quincy Adams. "The vice presidency was a station in which he could hang no one and in which he would need to quarrel with no one." Jackson had a bit of a temper. So both men are pretty disgusted at the fact that Jackson even made it. Not only did he make it this far, he beat both of them in the popular and electoral vote. Okay? Well, in the end, Clay decided to throw his support behind John Quincy Adams. Now, that only makes sense. Both men disliked Jackson, and if you think about it, their legislative agendas were pretty much the same. They both supported Henry Clay's American system. So they had the same outlook and philosophy. So the House voted, Clay threw his support behind Adams. Adams wins this election. Okay, the special election was held in the House in February of 1825. Adams is named the president. He'll be inaugurated on March 4th of 1825. Now, Jackson was pretty stunned by the fact that he didn't win. He just assumed that because he had the most electoral votes and had the biggest percentage of popular votes, that the House of Representatives would see that the people really wanted him. And then everything blew up. Shortly after being declared the winner, John Quincy Adams got around to picking people to be in his cabinet, and he asked Henry Clay to be in his cabinet. He asked Henry Clay to be the Secretary of State. And at that, Jackson lost his mind. Now, why would that make him angry? Well, what does it look like? To Jackson, he claimed that the two men made a corrupt bargain. That obviously what happened in Jackson's mind was that Adams had promised Henry Clay, hey, if you throw your support behind me, I'll make sure that you get a position in the cabinet. And being the Secretary of State was not just any position at this point. It was the stepping stone to the presidency. Up to this point, every single Secretary of State, except for one, had become the president. All right, Washington's Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. Okay, he becomes president. The one exception is that Adams' Secretary of State, John Adams, the first one, was John Marshall. Now, he didn't become president, but he became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the most important one we've ever had. Okay, then Jefferson's president, his Secretary of State's his best friend, James Madison. Then Madison becomes president, and his Secretary of State's Monroe. And then Monroe becomes president, and his Secretary of State is John Quincy Adams. Do you see what I mean? At this point, the Secretary of State job is the stepping stone to being the presidency. And Adams is livid and outraged. Not Adams, excuse me. Jackson is livid and is outraged. He thinks he's been cheated, that Adams and Clay made a corrupt bargain. It didn't take much to make him mad at those two. He didn't like either one of them anyway, and he knew they didn't like him. So Jackson there in early 1825 vows two things. Number one, he will make John Quincy Adams' presidency a living hell. He's going to oppose John Quincy Adams at every turn, and he is going to start campaigning for the presidency in 1828 right then and there. He will begin a 4-year campaign to be president, and he will eventually be successful. He'll win in 1828. We'll probably cover that election down the road too, because that one's pretty interesting as well. Okay, so the election of 1824 is significant for a number of reasons. Again, it ends in the House of Representatives. Again, there's only been 2 elections where the House of Representatives has chosen a president. So that's important, okay? This is also the last election to be decided that way. It hasn't happened since. Could it? It could. But, the 2-party systems, we've never had a third-party candidate really strong enough to pull that off yet. The closest was Teddy Roosevelt in 1912. This also spelled the breakup of the Democratic-Republican Party. You can imagine that after this happens, Jackson, Clay, and Adams are not going to be able to coexist in the same political party, right? So at this point, the Democratic-Republican Party breaks up. And now you go back to having 2 parties. Jackson and his followers become known as the Democrats, and they are the origin of the modern Democratic Party. They can trace their roots back to Andrew Jackson. Adams and Clay form a party called the National Republicans. Now, this is not where the modern Republican Party comes from. That party doesn't come about until the 1850s. but they call themselves the National Republicans. They'll only last for a couple elections. But this ushers in what they call the second party system in American politics. Okay? This also ushers in the Jacksonian era. For the next 20 years, Andrew Jackson will come to dominate politics in America. Now, he loses in 1824, as we've seen, but he's going to win in 1828. He'll win in 1832, and he's so popular that in 1836, he's able to handpick his successor. He's basically able to say to the Democratic Party, I want my buddy Martin Van Buren to be president. He gets the nomination and he wins. Now, his party loses in 1840, but in 1844, another Jackson protege, James K. Polk from Tennessee, will become president. So for the next 20 years, until his death in 1845, Jackson is the dominant force in national politics. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'll see you next time on Dr. Will's History Road Trip. I hope you enjoyed this edition of Dr. Will's History Road Trip. If you like what I'm doing and want to continue following, please subscribe to my channel and click the notification button so you'll get updates when I post new content. Also, please consider supporting me via PayPal, Venmo, or Cash App. Your support will enable me to go to interesting places and film them and talk about them with you. Feel free to suggest locations that you might like to see me visit in the comments below. Thank you very much, and I'll see you on the road.